Welcome to the Kenny Climate Dialogues. This is the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. I'm CJ Tremblay, and I have to tell you, it is so nice to be back. It's been 5 or 6 weeks since our last episode, and I just wanted to say a quick thanks to the listeners who reached out during this little unexpected hiatus to ask when we were coming out with new episodes and how much they've been enjoying the pod and that they're all caught up. Basically, y'all were caught up and it was time to get back to it. So that was super sweet and much appreciated. And if all of that positive reinforcement was designed solely to get us back here working on new episodes, congratulations. Honestly, it worked. I was so excited to be back to it. And it was definitely my fault, my big girl job, since this hosting gig is a volunteer one. It's been a real roller coaster lately, thanks to our friends at the Canadian government. If you keep tabs on Canadian international education news, you might have caught the announcement that the feds created a new pathway to residency for 40,000 international students, which is awesome. So great. As a marketer for a language testing provider, that created really an all-consuming sort of 5 or 6 weeks, which is coincidentally the exact same amount of time as our hiatus. Whoops. So that's a big mea culpa there. But we really are back just in time for this specific topic. This is, historically a very exciting time of year. I've just come off attending a couple different conferences in the last 3 weeks. The CAPSI conference, the Canadian Association of Public Schools International for K-12 International Sector in Canada, the ISEF Americas event, and a student-facing recruitment event. And all of them were virtual. And the mother of all conferences in international education, NAFSA, is just around the corner for a totally virtual event. And it's been super exciting and interesting because now, with a year of the pandemic under our belts, some conferences are doing their conferences virtually for the first time, because they just didn't have time to pivot. It's still just May and everything kind of went bananas in mid-March. So, some conferences that were at this time just didn't happen last year and were just completely just completely canceled. And some are virtual conferences for the second time. So we've learned a lot over the last year, and conferences are such a huge part of our professional development, our professional relationship building, our professional identities, honestly, that we wanted to dedicate an entire episode to talking about virtual conferencing, the good, the bad, the how to do it better as a participant, presenter, exhibitor, sponsor. There's just so much that we've learned. And I simply cannot imagine talking about this topic with anyone who is not Eveline Renders. You might remember Eveline from either our European Summit in November, or you loyal listeners might remember her from episode 7 with our friends at CBIE and CAIE, where we discussed virtual conferencing and a little bit about sort of the drivers, how it was going. But now we really want to dig into the participant experience and things that have been learned over the course of the last year. But before I welcome Eveline back to the show, I want to take a quick learning minute with our friends and sponsors of this podcast, the University of Auckland's International Office. You may recall during our last episode before our break, we chatted briefly with Brett Berquist from the University of Auckland because they were co-hosting the Times Higher Ed Innovation and Impact Summit with Penn State, which took place last month and was really, this is just another event that showcases how committed and dedicated they are to advancing sustainable development goals, not just globally, but also like in our sector. And I will chat with them about that summit in an upcoming episode, but I wanted to take a moment to highlight some of their work on SDGs. I promised a few episodes ago, I promised I'd share more of these stories with you. And so I shall, especially when there's a bunch of new case studies that they've produced, which were great. And just choosing which one would go next is always a challenge. But this one was excited because in this case study, Dr. Selina Shang from the Faculty of Business at the University of Auckland shares how they work and how their work is going to help us understand the relationship of humans to travel and technology, which is, seems fitting for our sector and is particularly relevant to the discussion of this episode. So here you go. Take it away.
Road transport contributes nearly 20% of New Zealand's total gross emissions. The goal of our research team is to help New Zealand mitigate all of the negative impacts from road transportation. Technological advances coupled with policy instruments can definitely help us to reduce the carbon footprints left by the transport sector and provide some foundations for enhanced energy efficiency. With respect to SDG 13 climate action, we need to firstly work out the relationship between future technologies and people's travel behaviors. We also need to figure out how new government policies could help Aotearoa transition to a low-carbon economy.
So I really, really love that story and the accompanying video if you prefer to catch our podcast on YouTube. And it's not just because it hits SDG number 13, which is climate action, which, as you all know, is core to what we're looking to advance, but it's also related to an existential issue that we deal with in our sector, and that's travel, emissions from flying, which, as you know, that's really the most carbon intensive activity that we take on. And most importantly, because Dr. Shen touches on policy and the use of policy instruments, and you all know that I'm a policy nerd and believe that there's power in our sector allows us to advocate for and shape better, more just and climate conscious policies. So I really love that part. And thanks again to our friends at the University of Auckland's International Office. As you've heard me say before, and I'm going to smile while saying it again because it makes me happy. It makes them happy as our sponsors, and I hope it makes you happy. But the University of Auckland's International Office is proud to sponsor the Canning Climate Dialogues podcast series. New Zealand is a unique place to think about climate through the lens of their Indigenous cultures. Leading the world's universities in the Times Higher Ed Global Impact Ranking as they work towards United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the international team at the University of Auckland shares you, our listeners, concerns about climate action and international education. The University of Auckland is answering the world's call. Whew, I love that. That's never going to get old. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for your support. Okay. Now here we go. Welcome, Eveline, my friend, our friend. How are you?
Thank you, CJ, for having me again as a co-host and guest at the same time. I'm very excited to be back and very thankful for this podcast. I have been listening to it avidly, and I've also heard a lot of other people in the business telling me how great this podcast is. So a lot of kudos to you for hosting this so brilliantly. You do this, amazingly. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you can come and be on any episode you want. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. So yeah, it's just the two of us today, which is exciting, feels super fun. And everyone who is listening is just going to get to hear what it's like whenever we talk and hang out anyway. But the last time you were on the show, you promised that you'd come back to talk about the article that you were hoping to publish or working on getting published, and you did. And I'm so happy you're here to talk about it with me and with our listeners. But before we jump into it, I kind of want to get our conference credentials, if you will, out of the way. Would love to hear about how many conferences pre-pandemic would go to in a year, how many conferences you've been to in the last year during the pandemic, and just get our bona fides out there.
Yeah, sure. Well, I know that you are a true conference vet, but actually, I'm a little bit of a weird duck, I think, in this regard, because I've mostly just jumped into organizing the conferences and the workshops and the webinars and not really attending them much before that. So, of course, I started organizing in 2015 when I was still working as a student assistant for a professor of mine. So that was the first conference that I organized. It was physically in person with about 30 participants. And I remember, being so impressed by the little informal networking lunch things where actually the real stuff was happening. So I was really, and also I was a little bit flabbergasted by people traveling like 5 days to be at a conference for 3 days, which was so crazy for me because I've never been that far out of my bubble, or at least like I've never traveled that far, and also not for a conference, of course. So after that, I was quite inspired, and I went to a few conferences, but most of them were in the neighborhood. A few big ones, few small ones, and then the last few years, I think the last 3 years, I've mostly been attending and giving a lot of workshops and educational things. So I was reviewing the 2020 year for myself a few months back, and I saw that I attended 7 intensive online workshops. So and each of them was about 2 to 4 weeks. The latest was the Climate Reality Leadership Program, the same one as you did.
Hey, congratulations.
Thanks. But also I did like an online alt MBA. I did advanced dialogue facilitation, digital sketchnoting,
cool.
A path to moral leadership, which is about social impact, a course in information management. So these were really different experiences, but all of them were either hybrid or totally virtual. And this inspired me to start my own training institution, as you know, last November, and start giving these workshops myself and being a speaker at more events, and like the Kenny event. Yeah, which was amazing.
Yeah, so that was, I did the same thing, sort of reflecting on like what conferences were like before the pandemic, and really looking at like how that's changed this year. So I was thinking about this. I did the same thing where before the pandemic, I was going to like 5 to 10 conferences a year. Since I've been doing that since like 2014, 2015. And a lot of them were like industry conferences, but then also some student facing like recruitment events. But since the pandemic, I've been to so many more. I've got loads of experience on both sides, from like an organizer, like to your point with Kenny, and supporting other people with their events, but a lot as a presenter, an exhibitor, a sponsor, and just like an attendee. So I just couldn't believe it. I've been to more than 15 just conferences or like virtual events, which is more than I've ever been to. And that's not accounting for any like training I've done or like workshops I've attended, but genuinely like conferences that included networking opportunities and the ability to like connect with, people on the circuit that you would sort of see out of town. So it was really wild. And because, that's my job, as you guys know, is promoting a service provider in the sector. So, but it was an incredible privilege sort of as part of my journey. So I do understand that, as a young professional, it shaped a lot of where I was. And so I do understand where our industry's connection to conferences and travel comes from, because it has shaped a lot of our careers. And it is no secret that I love conferences. I love conferences. And I am not going to qualify them with like in person or virtual. I just like love conferences. I love the people in our sector. I love the conversations that happen. And I just think, you know, I'm not going to pretend to not love conferences, both in person or virtual. I love them all. And I can't wait. I've talked about it in many podcast episodes before this, and I can't wait to talk about it because it brings us to your article. And I was so excited when you published it. I've read it a few times. I'm a fan. But I'd love if you could share with our listeners the little bit about your process and who you worked with and talked with to get this paper together. And dear listeners, you will see this shared on the Canny Twitter, and we'll link to it in this podcast description so that you guys can read it. You published this article on LinkedIn, yes?
Yeah, true. Yeah, at first we were looking to publish it in more like a research magazine, but actually one of them found it too, what did they call it? Too academical. And the other one found it too, like, not academic enough. So we were like, okay, you know what? What's amazing about having a LinkedIn platform is that we can just share it directly with everyone who wants to read it. So that's what we did. So the credit for the interviews, which lie at the basis of this article, actually go to Tuin Bousema and also Nadia Swijting. These are two employees at a university. They're researchers. And they conducted in-depth interviews with about 10 participants of conferences and 6 organizers. So these were like 2-hour deep dive interviews, and they transcribed it and took all of the interesting points from them. And then they contacted me and also Kate Whitfield to actually write it together. So to collaboratively write it. And I've never done that before. I've only written like blog posts for myself and those kinds of articles. But it was really interesting to do that as a true collaboration. So in a shared Dropbox file, like everybody commenting on each other and getting their little snippets in, and then making it the best paper we could actually. So that's what right now what's online, and we think like it reflects the first wave and the steep learning curve of the first wave of online conferences quite well. It has some really nice observations, quotes also from the interviewees to make it more personal. So yeah, go forth and read.
Yes. So yes, I loved it. And I was really excited to talk about it today. So a quick recap that we've shared before with practitioners, faculty, staff, administrators, all those people in our sector. We do a lot of traveling, and some research is emerging on the scale of some student travel, but we still have like a very little understanding of the impact of all of our professional travel, notably for conferences. And that's okay. We don't need to have all the details to know that we can probably do a little bit better. So in terms of setting the scene in your article, you open with some context about the carbon footprint of virtual conferences versus in-person conferences. And I'm wondering if you could, I'd love if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I'd like to refer to an even more recent study that was done by the Young Academy in the Netherlands. It's a association of researchers, young researchers, and it was called Flying High but Flying Less. And they actually based it on an inventory of recent sustainability reports in the sector from all Dutch universities, and they also interviewed policymakers. And combining that, they've had 3 big outcomes. One was that flying has a major impact, as we just said, on the CO2 emissions of Dutch universities. But they estimate that it is 27 up to 27% of CO2 emissions. Just let that sink in, just almost 30% at one of the universities. And then there was another university, they were estimating it at 15%. Still, that's a lot. That's if you can cut 1/10 of your carbon emissions in this way, I mean, we have to look at all the possibilities. Mm-hmm. So this really underlines the importance of this topic for me. And then number 2 of their conclusions was that universities are still investing too little in reducing emissions from flying. Half of the policymakers that were interviewed actually complained of a lack of resources. The investments that are made at this point are actually into making real estate more sustainable or financing alternatives to flying, which is not a priority at this moment. So, but they do see that this can make a huge impact. So we're thinking that with this report, it will also change, and with the policymakers being made more aware how much impact this will have. And then the third conclusion that they had was that the policies of universities to reduce emissions, those that are already there, are actually very fragmented. They are quite powerless, and they are ineffective. So that wasn't really hopeful. But they said that the commitment to reducing flying really varies very much between these universities in the Netherlands. It doesn't come as a surprise that one of the more nature-oriented universities that we have is actually doing the most in case of flight reduction and having a great policy to sustain that. Yeah, so those are some results from November last year, but more research is being done every day. A few of our colleagues also who are working on CANI are working on that really hard.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful for the future, but there's still a long way to go. And there's a huge, huge, huge impact to be made with this.
I love that. And I thank you for highlighting that article. We'll also link to it in the description. But what I love about it, and you wouldn't know this because I would never subject you to one of my ad reads, so because I start and stop a lot of times. But policy in the University of Auckland's the ad read that we did earlier, they speak specifically about policy instruments and how powerful they can be when done right. And so I love that you're talking about policy here in terms of what's happening. And in the article, you also address, I think we've talked about those astronomers from the UK before, where they said that the carbon footprint was like 3,000 times less from people who travel. So there's a huge potential in emissions reductions, which is, as you were sharing here, a huge part of universities' emissions. So we can do better. And so, but I also want to flag that, and we've talked about this before, there is no such thing as climate action without sort of justice at the core, right? So let's talk about the justice elements, because you did sort of allude to this a couple times in your article. So tell me a little bit about how, like, virtual conferences, sort of the good and bad around sort of the justice piece there.
Yeah, sure. If we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is most of the times, those are the three that are named. The accessibility aspect of virtual conferences and training, they seem almost limitless, except, of course, for stable internet and a working device to access the internet. But if we look at the academic world, then these are already basic needs. And I think that access to any campus in the world will actually provide these things to you. Most of the times, these virtual opportunities are also a bit cheaper. Like we already mentioned last time, that the pricing of virtual opportunities, of course, it's much more scalable. Pricing can go down that way. And then also you don't have the venue to have the catering. There are a few costs that don't have to be made. And there's also what we saw, an organizer more easily gives out scholarships or free passes to people who actually can't afford the entry fee that is set, because an extra free access pass doesn't cost them anything, doesn't cost them like travel costs. It's easier to give as an organizer. So that means that also these people can more easily access it. And so this accessibility issue is certainly one of the big advantages. And then, of course, you also have more of the character types. If we look at character types like introverts or extroverts, we already know that you can be both. But if you are feeling a bit more introverted that day, then it would be nice to attend a virtual conference instead of having to go somewhere where you're like put under pressure. We had it echoed also when in the interviews that people said it's easier to ask questions in the chat than in real life because there's not a room full of people watching you when you do that.
Oh my gosh.
And also
Totally.
one of the it's so recognizable, right? Even as an extrovert, that's really recognizable.
Oh yeah, 100. Yeah, that's it. I read that and I was like, I relate to that 1,000,000%. I have never asked a question in person at a conference ever.
No. Yeah, so I think it's a really good skill, of course, for you to build. But I don't know if it's necessary to put that stress in a conference. Like, it's a very necessary skill to have when you're studying in a university to be able to formulate a good question. But you can also do that in a safe environment of a classroom where you can actually go into depth with the question instead of like having to do it on the spot in front of like 400 people.
Yeah, and being able to engage in the Q&A. Like, I know that for me, I have formulated lots of great questions in my head. They've just never left my mouth. And when I was at an in-person event, and now I find myself definitely engaging more on like the Q&A and the chat functionality. And so that was really, I hadn't thought about that in terms of like an accessibility from like a character types perspective. And you also talk about sort of, people who have childcare responsibilities or don't have the funds to travel, or they're unable to for sort of any number of reasons. And you just had a lot of really great points in there. And I thought that it was worth talking about. And from a professional standpoint, there are like, I've never been to 15 conferences in a year. And a lot of times when we participate as a conference, we go maybe a couple people because it's expensive to send people. But it has been really great for sort of younger members of my team who maybe aren't as familiar with the circuit or the sector to be able to attend and learn in a way that they would not have been able to before. Because as I sponsor events, I'm able to take sort of higher sponsorship costs and sort of contribute more to the organization, which is sort of great from my perspective, but it gives me more money to send people on my team who would not have been able to go, even if we have bigger sponsorships. So that's been great for like the next generation or like professional development for people who traditionally just don't have access to conferences because it's maybe a little bit outside of their scope,
True. Yeah. If we look at the EAIE conference, it was kind of a tradition at my university, Radboud University, to for more of the leadership people to go because there was a lot of networking and they had to like speak to their partners. But that also meant that the junior staff actually missed out on all of the learning opportunities that are also at that conference. Perhaps the networking would be even more efficient for them because they don't have a network yet, but also it was a requirement to go there. So there was this weird thing. And then, if I might say that there are still, much more men in leadership positions at our university, even though we're making great steps, you still see it that, that women are just not that much in these team leader positions. So they would go a little bit less. So I really
totally
like this.
That's great. Yeah, I totally agree with you. 1,000,000%. Yes. So in terms of what conferences are, doing well, not well, in the article you talked about, specifically you were able to point to things that were successful, not so successful. But at one point you had a reference to the time turner that Hermione would use from Harry Potter, which is a device that lets you go back in time and for, fun little reasons if you're in high school. But that's a device that I've yearned for my entire life because there are just not enough hours in the day. And so I loved that. And you made that connection to that being sort of one of the biggest advantages of online conferences, that they were almost like time turners themselves.
True, true. And I'm so happy that you called this little reference out because Teun and I were very excited to have our own Harry Potter reference in a paper. So yeah, that was a high point for us. You call it the biggest advantage, and it's interesting because it's also a little bit of a controversial advantage. But perhaps that's more from my perspective than from the interviewee's perspective. So as we know from Harry Potter, like Hermione wanted to follow more classes than she could, than her schedule allowed. So she got this time turner necklace from Dumbledore. And just like at a virtual conference, you can actually rewatch the sessions that you missed while you were attending another session. However, it is also pointed out in the book that Hermione is actually exhausted all the time and that she barely manages to finish all her studies because of this, having to juggle all these different courses at once and doing all of the assignments that go with the courses, of course. So I find this a nice parallel because also at a virtual conference, when you want to see it all and do it all, it might spread you a little thin, and it might also be a little bit of a cognitive overload. So this is a very well-known cognitive bias as well, known as choice overload or the paradox of choice, which describes how people get overwhelmed when they are presented with a large number of options to choose from. And then they want to choose it all sometimes. I wouldn't really recommend it, but now we're going into the recommendations already a little bit. But for me, like my crucial recommendation for people who are visiting conferences is to beforehand look at what is your goal of attending. Like, do you want to network? Do you want to get something out of it in professional development? And then which themes are actually the ones that you want to focus on? And please choose. Please don't be afraid to choose. And to not spread yourself so thin. So that's actually, it's fun because it's a little bit controversial. And I think it's very personal as well.
So interesting, because that like paralysis that you're talking about, I have never felt that at virtual conferences. I have only felt that at in-person conferences because literally I could make a bad choice and leaving the room and going across, especially at NAFSA, like, which is just like, you're like running a 100-meter dash to get to your conference, to your other presentation, where I've just had like such FOMO of making the bad choice that I like sometimes would get really anxious. And I felt that at conferences online, I've been able to make a choice. And I'm like, if I'm not like super feeling it, it's like 3 clicks to get into another session. And so I don't feel like I'm committing an hour of my time that I can't get back if I made a bad choice. Yeah. And sometimes there genuinely are like a couple of really good presentations. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's very personal. And everyone knows best for themselves, like if they are subject to this paralysis easily or not. And or if they like to, prepare in advance and like choose wherever they want to go, very control-like, or if they want to just let it go and just see where they go with the flow, just click a few links and be inspired.
I've been at a couple of conferences in person and online with people like that. And I'm a bit more of a planner. Anyone who knows me is like, yeah, that's 0% surprising. But I would really love to hear people's thoughts on this. And so I hope that as you are realizing this conversation, there's lots of different people with lots of different opinion, like send us tweets and let us know sort of where your head's at on what you're feeling with respect to paralysis. Is it better or worse in the face of, is it better or worse with virtual conferences? Okay. So you mentioned this before, like the networking and having to make choices. And so this is the next big one that you mentioned in your article. I was surprised by what you came out with. You quoted an organizer who said 40% of our attendees actually found it easier to network online. 40%. Easier. I have to tell you, I was so encouraged by that and so surprised. So what did your research tell you about what people liked about virtual networking?
Yeah, so in the first place, as we mentioned before, networking was found to be more accessible by people who are introverted or people who just like to be at home in a safe space. And they could listen in the background and then send their question via chat message or participate in the Q&A more easily. And then they could send a chat message to one person that they really, that said interesting things, and then they could plan a one-on-one meeting, for example. I must say that as an extrovert, I also love how I can talk to very many different people in this virtual networking event, and I can actually choose what to do. I can do it more like in a random way, where I just go into a room and I have no clue who I'm going to meet and who I will be inspired by. And this is amazing. This is kind of simulates the going to the bar and just like looking where the laughter is at and then joining that conversation.
Man. Yep.
Yeah, you really feel that, right? Like you scan the room and then you see, oh, they are laughing. Okay, they are laughing. Okay, I think that they look interesting. And you just go there.
You're so brave. I'm definitely someone who benefits from the networking from like, okay, I'm only going to talk to the people that I kind of like need to talk to or think that I might have something in common with, or like find the networking events that are like subject matter specific, because there's nothing I have like such high level of anxiety around like going to talk to people that I don't know or like aren't friends of someone that I know, and like just walking to where the laughter is. If I don't recognize a face, I'm probably not walking over to that. But I love that about you. I love that.
I make it kind of a sport. I just see it as some kind of a sport to just like try to ease myself into the conversation naturally, which sometimes fails dramatically, and then that's also fun. Like you have to have a healthy dose of humor for this. Yeah, and then it's also crucial to start with, like, why are you making this network event? Like, why are you organizing it? So as an organizer, you could ask yourself, like, is it for attendees that want to talk about a topic more deeply? Then you might go with breakout rooms per topic, which you really like because you can, control and say like, oh, I want to go to that topic. And then you could also say, no, I want people to really enlarge their network in more of a speed networking kind of way. And then you could do quick rounds of like 5 minutes, one-on-one conversations where people just have a fun icebreaker that they can use and that they can get to know each other with. So there are these different ways of organizing it. And I think that you have to know as an organizer that you need to be a little bit more structured in your approach. So there needs to be a little bit more of a tactical approach as an organizer, to think about it beforehand, like how do I want to create this easy space for people where they don't feel like they're like put in a room with people they don't know and no structure. So you want to provide a little bit of structure and then also make sure that people can get loose whenever they feel like it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a feeling.
Yeah. So there's lots of, I think you talk about like software and how that can be such a huge, we're all getting used to these new platforms. I said earlier, I've been to like 15 conferences. I've also been on like 10 different platforms because we're all just kind of like figuring out what works, what's great, what's less great about some of the platforms. And you're kind of relearning every time you go. And so as a, I know we're going to talk about that later, but I thought that was really interesting because that's also applicable for like not just a conferencing platform, but like the networking platforms, because there's lots of them popping up and
so true. Yeah. So one of them that I recently very much liked was a spatial.chat. It actually lets you hear the conversations of people who are in the surrounding space according to how far away they are, like their avatar on the screen. If they are further away, you hear like a little mumble. And if they're closer by, they actually get louder and louder. Whoa. So that really mimics that kind of feeling that you're not alone there. Like if you're talking in a group of 3, then you actually hear a little bit of background noise because those are the other groups that are talking to each other.
Whoa, that's such a trip. That's cool. I didn't know that.
It's really nice. And then on the other hand, I do feel like those like new platforms are still a little bit buggy. And sometimes they don't scale as well. So if you have many participants, then it might just drop out and you don't want that at your conference. So if you have a high stakes conference or like something more professional than just drinks with friends, I would always go with the tried and tested platforms in the beginning, and then start venturing out when they mature, when these new software tools mature in like a year or two.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot about like some of the cool things and what we really liked, being able to like look for people to talk to, having a lot of different options for next working. What were some of the challenges, and can we even overcome them?
Ooh, of course we can. We can overcome challenges as long as we are aware of them beforehand. So a few of them. The first one, I would say, don't put more than 10 people in a room together, because it ensures that almost no one talks, at least if you don't have like an icebreaker that you have beforehand communicated very clearly, like, okay, we're going to talk about this, or we're going to play this little game or something. If you just put 10 people in a room, it will be a little bit awkward. The optimal group size, I would say, is a little bit bigger than when you're at an in-person conference, because at in-person conferences, you stand in this noisy conference hall around a table, and you hear at max 4 people, and otherwise you're out of earshot. But in a virtual space, you could say like 6 to 8, 6 to 10 people. That would create a nice conversation, a nice flow. And then, like I just said, I think that the organizer should have a little bit more orchestrating beforehand than just saying, okay, the bar is open, guys, just go ahead. You don't want to throw people into the deep end, especially in these first like 2-3 years when people are still getting used to the format. I think in 5 years, we will all be pros in virtual networking, and you could actually say, okay, guys, I've opened this whole bar, like this virtual bar, go ahead. And then people will just start organizing themselves like they do in real life conferences. So giving a little bit more of expectation management beforehand, that you say, okay, we expect from you to have your camera on, to have your mic unmuted. Here are a few fun icebreakers that we will do to get, the mood rolling. So those are things that you can do.
Yeah, no, that's true. And we're all still so new at this.
Yeah.
Like, I think every event I've been to that has networking, it's like, it's always a little bit awkward, but like, there's so much understanding that we're all just figuring this out still. So I was like, it's been a year of this, but also it's only been a year of this. And so I think that there's so much farther that we would go, and you're totally right. Okay. So one of the other sections of your article, I think it's just perfect. Like, it's perfect. The header is learning to attend and improve virtual conferences. And I have to tell you that completely resonated with me. I know that at first, nobody wanted virtual conferences, right? It's part of the ethos, the energy, the like history of our sector. I used to call it Schmooze Town. I still call it Schmooze Town, honestly. But conferences were part of, the circuit, and there were things that we all looked forward to. It was hilarious and delightful to run into people that I literally live in the same city with, but only ever see them in places like Miami, New Delhi, like Kuala Lumpur, whatever. And so this is a very different skill set that is required, these virtual conferences. And you mentioned that, but you also talked about preparation, because we have agency, right? Like, virtual conferences being successful is not just up to the organizers. We have agency as participants, attendees, speakers, exhibitors, sponsors. And so I would love to dig into this a little bit more. What was the most surprising finding from, those conversations that you had about what people thought about where they're responsible, like what they were responsible and where their responsibilities lie in making virtual events a success?
Yeah, so I was kind of also a little bit surprised that this came from the interviews, but this really came from the participants themselves. So they said, like, okay, treat this like you would an in-person conference. So one of the more basic recommendations would be, please just make sure that your calendar is blocked, that your out of office message is set up, that you have an out of virtual office message in your Outlook or something. So you're legitimately away from your desk and you're actually in another atmosphere. And then there were conferences where they were organizing like these breaks together. So you had a little yoga lesson, or you had a little meditation, or you had a little stretch, which I think is really nice. But also just getting outside in between, sessions just clears your head and makes sure that you're just way more attentive during the sessions, just like at a real conference. So this is actually quite similar. Only you have to decide on it more actively beforehand. Like clearing your schedule is something that you have to do. Otherwise, you just have other meetings popping up in between, which is context switching, which we're not good at as humans.
Yeah, totally.
And then, engaging in the social activities as well. It just creates this atmosphere switch, which I think is crucial. If you only look at the sessions, like the informative sessions, then you really only get half of the conference. So really actively sending out your own messages is very crucial to having this conference experience as well. And one of the things that I find interesting, which I just read about recently, was how different environments and different people actually create these hooks in your brain where you can hang different context. So some people might experience in this pandemic a little bit of a brain fog, because everything happens in the same room. Like they're in their workroom, they are on their computer, they're looking at the screen. And even though they are talking to different people, it's still the same screen. And it creates a little bit of a memory loss situation where days flow into each other and you feel like they're all the same. So one of the things that I'm really looking forward to, but this is future talk, is virtual conferences in 3D, in virtual reality.
Ooh.
Because it just creates so many more triggers for your brain, because you see 3D and you can walk around and you can actually, at one point, perhaps even feel stuff. It does actually make it less accessible, of course, because who has a virtual reality set? But then again, I mean, future talk, I think it's an exciting prospect, at the least, but it's a little bit of a futuristic view.
Yeah, the idea of that is really cool. I know my family, I did a VR headset once at like a trade show, and I just think it's really cool. You're right about sort of, you talk about accessibility and technology and that stuff, but the future CJ and future Eveline will definitely party in a VR conference somewhere. Okay, so this is what I really wanted to dig into, and so I think that this is a good way to sort of maybe start wrapping up here in terms, because we're the Climate Action Network, and so you started to allude to actions that participants, can take, and based on sort of your research. So summarizing that, and so we're going to talk about actions that people can take now. So write this down, friends, or actually, honestly, don't, because we're probably just going to post it on Instagram or like create a handy list. But if we could make a list for our listeners of things that they can do to improve their virtual conference experiences, we'll just summarize some of the things that we said. So participants, we'll talk about participants first. So if you're an attendee or you're a participant, I think if we had to like list off a few things, I'd say definitely like log in beforehand and familiarize yourself with the tech platform. A lot of conferences will give you like a week beforehand to sort of look around and get comfortable and start messaging people. And I think that is really great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for
pretty
sure.
critical. And, we do this for in-person conferences too. It's just that I think these sneak up on us. Because we're not planning travel around it. We don't have it as this thing that is going to change our daily routine. So they tend to sneak up on us. And okay, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just like projecting that on everybody else, because I know that I do it all the time. Because
you're not.
Okay, that's helpful.
People are recognizing this everywhere where they're listening. Yeah, and that brings us, of course, to point 2, which we just mentioned. Like set an out of office message, also on your Slack or your Teams environment, and then turn on the notifications from the app or the platform that you're using for the conference. So turning off the email notifications, turning on the platform notifications. I think that would be a nice way to get into the conference atmosphere.
Totally. And I would actually even say like on like point 2A, if you will, like let people know that you're at a conference and then you're at a virtual conference and you're just trying to be present. And so you want to like add to the conference and be present and get as much as you can from it. So you will add, and that you will respond in conference breaks as you would if you were out of the office.
It also spreads the word a little bit, like the consciousness about that these things are actually conferences and it's not just like going to a webinar and in the meantime checking your email.
Yeah, like normalize virtual engagement and like supporting your staff and doing that. So I like this. You sort of started talking to this because you love messaging people. I love messaging people. My like in-person network game is not great, but like messaging people on the app, like get in the game. Like you can post in comment spaces, try out the networking tables. Maybe, you talked about video chatting with people that have same interests as you, because you can filter by interests. And so that was really interesting to me. And so I would reach out to people and ask them about sustainability or like ask them about sort of marketing in a new country that we were expanding into. So that's definitely something that I think is helpful.
Yeah, it's a good list. 4 things, people.
Yeah, 4. Yeah. Tell us.
Get them into action.
And but the fourth one really, and this, I don't know, do you guys do this? But we have a group chat with everybody in our, because usually it's just like me and some other person. And then, I can just like text them, but it's been really fun to have a group chat with people that I'm there with my organization. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are more people there.
Well, actually, we haven't done that yet. Although we did one thing when it was still allowed. We actually went to a conference room at our university, and we actually sat there with 10 people, like with 1.5 meters distance, and then have the session like on the screen, so that we could discuss it amongst ourselves while joining like this big session from EAIE last year. So we had our little gathering inside of a conference.
Okay, so exhibitors. So we've got a few key points. I'm sure there's more. And what I'm hoping is that like people send us via Twitter or on Instagram or LinkedIn, like what other things that you're doing as a participant and attendee to be present and like to really get the most out of a virtual conference. Exhibitors. I've shared this a lot. I am a regular conference sponsor. I love giving my money to conference sponsors. And I got to tell you, I love doing it even more in virtual conferences. So, but as an exhibitor or a sponsor, if you are trying to advance climate consciousness in the sector, because we know how much travel is around conferences, sponsoring these and, putting your money where your mouth is and leveraging your money as power and purse strings to keep these conferences sustainable as being virtual. So we know so many of them, rely on conference revenues. Organizations rely on conference revenues. And so this is an important piece of this. I think that this is where our sector and service providers can step up and support these sector leaders. I would also say as an exhibitor, proactively outreach, like waiting for people to come by your booth back in the day. That is not how virtual conferencing works. It's like the complete opposite. It's a bit more of a like proactive approach and letting people, of course, like your virtual booth will be, but inviting people to like come check it out and letting them know that there's something that might be specific to them, that is of interest, or relevant based on sort of what you know, or that you have a presentation or that you have a video about scholarships or whatever it is that is pertinent to the context of the presentation or the event.
That's a good one, to start with the content, start with a little bit with the why. And also, if it's possible, it would be nice if you could contribute also to the conference in the form of content, like giving a session, facilitating a session. I know that with Liornova, we just led a session on essential digital skills in an international staff training week, for example. And we said like, yeah, we can host that session. It was very well reviewed in the end. So that was really nice. And then they also got to know, our company and if they visit our website, that's just a big bonus. So yeah.
And that's exactly right. A lot of sponsorships will offer like a presentation as part of it, which is like making that presentation something that's like gonna be really valuable to the attendees from from like a content perspective. And that's not necessarily different, but because you're virtual, you can engage with a wider range of people. So if your clients are kind of all over the place in a virtual conference, like you don't have to bring someone from like, I don't know, India and Korea to present together. You can sort of do it or in a way that like you can do it in the way that you couldn't before. Presenters. So this one, if you're a presenter or speaker, there's some good ones here. This is an opportunity. And you said in your article that like the presentations were a much higher caliber and could be a lot better, and more engaging. And so you can add multimedia. So I'd say like one, like really create more engaging presentations because you have more tools. Add digital media, would be one of the first things we would do. And I would say a second thing is engage with like the chat and Q&A if it's pre-recorded. If it's pre-recorded, you're free when you're also speaking. So like engage with the community there, start answering questions or let people know that you're there and that you can answer questions and that you're willing. So those are a couple from me. And I know you have some as well.
Yeah. As a quick add, it's something that still kind of annoys me. Please, please, please invest in a good webcam and more importantly, even a microphone. So this doesn't have to cost that much. And most of the times also your employer or something will actually contribute to this. But if you're a regular speaker, please invest in having good audio and good feed because it's just, it's the way you're presented and audio is so important.
And I'm totally breaking my own like rule today. You look amazing, but like lighting's helpful. And making sure that your lighting is nice. But also like run through. Be familiar with the screen sharing. So I would say like those are the 4 things that we would say to people, like making sure your environment is good, and then practicing. Right. Because it's new. We've all been like speaking in front of classrooms forever or at conferences for a long time, but this is a totally new beast. So don't be shy to practice with your fellow presenters or make those transitions smooth between like sharing content. So.
Oh, I have one more little addition.
Okay.
I was just looking at you and I'm noticing that you're looking like a little bit like towards the camera and it feels like we're engaging, personally because we're looking at each other. So try, if you find it awkward to look into the camera, then try to look a little bit underneath it or something, like cheat a little bit. That's fine.
I have your face right below my camera hole right now, just so that I can like look at you and talk to you. So there you go.
Where I like to be, below your camera
exactly, right there, just so I can see you. Okay. And so for organizers, I would say, and this comes from you, and I know that you're going to have some thoughts, but like, and we're seeing so much of this. So I honestly like don't really want to get into I really don't want to deep dive in this one because organizers are doing everything that they can. But like what we're seeing is, people aren't defaulting to the same thing as we do in person. Like they're starting with like, why are we doing this? And they're building around that. And so I love that. So I'm like so sensitive to how much people are sort of pushing forward that I almost don't want to say too much.
No, we
but
don't want to put too much pressure on it.
I mean, but like I've really enjoyed seeing. Yeah, exactly. And like people have incentivized participation and engagement in like really interesting ways. And you are saying a lot that like making sure that the networking is structured to suit your goals. I think that that's really powerful. And I think this was your last point about.
Then there's also the opportunity to gather a little bit more anonymous feedback from participants, like right at the moment when they're feeling the feedback as well. So like 5 minutes before the end of a session or 2 minutes before the end of the session, just say, hey, we would love your feedback, and have a very quick poll. And it helps you so much to have that feedback and to see where can we do better the next time. It's a great opportunity. Don't miss it.
Yeah. Okay. But like on that topic though, sorry, I have to say this. I can't not say this. I see a lot of surveys that ask the wrong questions, or like posts that ask the wrong questions. So I can see like, would you prefer an in-person conference or a virtual conference? That question makes me crazy, and it's asking the wrong question. And I see it posted on message boards at a conference recently. I saw that, and I completely cracked, and I had to like share some strongly worded thoughts with some friends to properly articulate it. But like, first of all, we're isolated and I haven't seen anyone. I'd rather do anything in person right now than like not at home. So like the context that we're asking these things doesn't really make sense. But second, that question is also wrong because it's incomplete. We are not asking people to take into account the cost when we're asking that question. I've likened it to like someone asking me if I'd rather have a penthouse condo or like the 700 square foot apartment I rent in right now. Like, of course I would rather have a penthouse condo and 2 walk-in closets and a theater room. But you didn't ask me if I still want that penthouse, if I would be paying for it for 100 years and my 100-year mortgage would be offloaded to my children and grandchildren and their grandchildren. Because that's the right question. Do I still want the penthouse? Like, kind of, yeah, but it's not the right thing to do for future generations. And that question makes me question like crazy. So yeah, it'd be nice to go back to the same old conference schedule and get to see all my friends in fun places. Would I prefer in-person conferences? Sure. But of course I probably would. I would be lying if I said that I wasn't. But that's not the right question. Would I prefer an in-person conference schedule as it was before, knowing the cost of the emissions and waste that come from those conferences, and that the people who will carry the burden of that conference and that travel and that same schedule will be, historically marginalized community, the BIPOC community and poor countries? No, of course not. That's not the right thing. And it makes me crazy when I see that question. So anyway, thank you for indulging me, and my apologies. No, not my apologies, but like, thank you for indulging me in that like survey question. That survey feedback is super important.
Yeah, asking the right question is crucial. It's crucial. And to add to that, actually, my own personal annoyance is when people answer the question or they have a third option, which is the future is hybrid. And I know I have said this too, but what I like is for it to be the start of the conversation and not the end. So the future is hybrid is never the end of the conversation, because hybrid is so difficult, much more difficult than either in person or either virtual. It is just hybrid is you have to think of everything again. So start the conversation with hybrid. And not end it like that. So that's my little annoyance coming out.
Too true. I love it. I'm glad we each have our own thing. Okay, so last but not least, let's wrap up with our hopes for what conferences could look like. We know that online conferences are here to stay, but what do we hope to see for the sector, and what do we hope to see for conferences?
That's a good one. Always ending on a hopeful note. So for me personally, my hope is that we can get used to this new form of organizing and attending virtual conferences, so that we don't want to go back to traveling all the time anyway. But as you mentioned, there will always be people who want to go back. So I foresee a future in which organizers and attendees actually make a conscious choice, which you also mentioned, whether or not to have a physical component in their program in any matter. Like, I would say it again, that hybrid is not the end of the conversation. And if you let's just start with virtual every time. So let's just make it a virtual first approach. And then there's a conscious choice, if you want, that you could add an in-person element to it. If you say, I really want to focus on, let's say I want to invite all the speakers so that they can give their session in a well-lit studio with mics and everything, then you could do that and you could just invite the speakers. But that would be a very conscious choice to add upon your virtual event. So that would be my hope, just virtual first. That would be without me
I
stumbling.
I love that. That's incredible. I think that that's so interesting about like you talk about incentive for like being a speaker and presenting a good session and putting together something really powerful. That's great. Um, my hope, I don't have any notes written about this. So I'm like, ooh, I never thought about what I would say. But I think my hope is that like our conference organizers are taking a lead on really transforming and providing good virtual experiences, right? Like they're doing everything that they can. But I also hope that they would, as a sector, like will organize themselves. So because each of the like I don't look at the conference schedule and think, well, this one's not important. It could be cut. Like that's not what I think about. I think that every single one of those conferences that we attend has demonstrable value to the sector, to the practitioners who attend, to the speakers, to the people who are networking for the first time. Like the perspectives are like super important. But I would hope that they sort of organize themselves. And perhaps, maybe they, we talked about this CAIE when you were on our podcast last is once every 2 years. And maybe there's like a circuit of where there are just fewer conferences every year, but in, a cycle of, the cycle every 4 years. The Olympics are every 4 years and everyone loves that. Like,
we also talked about, I remember with this same conference, we talked about how there might not even be a need for like this pinpointed conference, but perhaps it could be spread out over a month or a week, or perhaps even it's just a platform, it's an app, it's a continuous conversation, it's a community. I mean, who knows? I think some conferences might switch to being a community.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that was a really interesting point from that conversation. I totally forgot about it until just now, but I'm seeing it because the Canadian Association of Public Schools International, the CAPSI conference, I am going back and watching sessions. I almost like, I don't always do that. And we have access to it for 90 days, which most platforms do, but they don't really engage us or encourage us to come back. So there's a different way of thinking. But then as we talk about the responsibility of participants is actually, I am going to go back and watch those sessions that I missed out on, or I am going to reach out to that person and they'll get an email. I know they'll get an email if I look at, if I send them a chat message on the platform. So I think that that's a really interesting point too. And I don't know that I would have put that as my hope, but I do hope that whatever happens, we are continuing those conversations on those platforms long after. And, that's a really interesting, I think that that's something that I didn't hope for it before, but I hope for it now. And that people can join it, not just, they can join it at any time. And that, because that content presumably is not just relevant for this one particular moment in time.
It could even make the follow-up a little bit easier. Like if we can hold each other a little bit better to the follow-up, because I know that my colleagues come back from conferences with like lists and lists and lists of ideas, and then they're just working their asses off to just to just make sure that they all get there. While if you could spread it out a little bit more and keep the conversation going, you wouldn't need like to have this one moment where you have to make all these action plans and then implement them.
Yeah. Because once you come back, everything just like on top of all the conference stuff, like regular work and everything that backed up just kind of, percolate, comes back to the surface. And all of a sudden you don't have quite as much time to follow up. And so if we give ourselves more time, because it's sort of extended in the conference, some conferences that were 3 days are now 5 days. And I love that because people get more familiar with the platform. So my hope is that the sector, like the organizers and the sectors, will like organize themselves and look at like how we can reduce and maybe leverage their conference platform from the previous year until the next one. So and so maybe those two things together like create like a really interesting conference sector cycle and community. I don't know, but this was lovely to like hope for and imagine. with you as an organizer and as an attendee.
With you too. Yeah, it was very inspiring. And I'm looking forward to all the next conferences that we'll attend together or speak at together. So that will be fun.
As always, such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I think we were both in the right headspace with our Ministry of the Future, both reading that book recently, where we're just like really in a mindset of like, what does the future look like? So being in a mindset of the help of that book, The Ministry of the Future, is a lot of has probably helped our conversation here today. But also you're just such a joy and like so good at what you do. So thank you for helping push this conversation forward and for your perspective and for the research. And thank you to everyone who is listening. And please send us your comments. We will certainly post this on all of the social media. And we would love to see some comments in the questions, sort of comments on the questions that we asked here. You know, what do you want to see? What do you do that helps you be more present? So Eveline, thank you so much. And I hope to have more of this dialogue in the future.
Thanks for inviting me again. And I just want to add, yes, everyone, please contact us if you found this relevant, because today I had a coffee with someone who contacted me after the last podcast, actually. And it was a lovely conversation about climate action in higher education in the international office. So always up for that.
Beautiful. Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Canny Climate Dialogues podcast is engineered by Diego Mendez, who is based in Vancouver. He edits these episodes together, making us look and sound super professional. And also, he uploads these episodes to wherever you listen or watch this podcast.